Hi everyone, it's Liz. I hope you're all doing well. In today's video, I'll be making an 1890s foundation petticoat out of a pile of bed sheets. If you saw the teaser trailer that I released last week, then you'll know that I'm going to the Prior Attire Victorian Ball in April, and I will be attending that with my friends Claire and Bryony, so we're all making a full 1890s ensemble to wear. This video is the first in a series, so keep watching and I'll show you how I made my petticoat. The pattern that I'm using as a base for this petticoat is the Truly Victorian TV125. It's a pattern for an 1879 petticoat, but it's also described as being good for giving support to 1890s skirts that need slimness in front and fullness behind. This is the foundation petticoat that I'm going to make, so I'll make it without the inner back ruffle. What you can maybe see is that this part here is actually held out by a stack of ruffles that are on an inner back piece. So I'm going to make it without the inner back piece and without the ruffles, and I'm going to add a deeper single ruffle from about knee length, and then I'm going to finish that ruffle at the bottom with some broderie anglaise. So hopefully it should look a little bit like this. The back panel will be pleated into the waistband just to give it a little bit of fullness at the back. The ruffle at the top will be finished with some insert lace broderie anglaise, and then the bottom will be finished with some gathered broderie anglaise. So I'm making a size E, which matches up with my hip measurement, but my waist measurement is 30 inches. So what I'm going to do is grade out the pattern from about the hip to a size F at the waist. So here you can see that I've cut my outer back pieces, and I've done the same thing on the outer back and the front and sides, where I've graded at this notch here. I've graded out to a size F. So I've done that on both the front and sides and the outer back. And also what I've done is along this line here, which says lengthen or shorten on dotted line, which isn't actually dotted, but let's ignore that. I've just folded that up by an inch. That's an inch there, so once that's folded over, that's actually 2 inches lost off the length. And I've done that in 2 separate places, so that has shortened this by about 4 inches overall. To prepare the bed sheets, I had to cut off the elastic around the edges. And then slice open the fitted corners. These bed sheets were given to me by my mum because they were ripped and threadbare in places, so I have to be careful to work around the big holes. I start by cutting the front panels. And to make life easier, I cut the straight edges of these front panels, which will become the centre front, on the hemmed edges of the sheets. And that's just so that I don't have to bother finishing them later. I cut them out using my not very authentic electric scissors, just for speed and because I love them. These are excellent for cutting through absolutely anything. I pin the front panels together and join them on the sewing machine from the hip notch down, leaving an opening at the top so I can get the petticoat over my hips when I put it on. And because the edges are already hemmed, I don't need to worry about finishing them. You'll see that I'm quite slow and stop-starty on sewing these seams because I hate to sew over pins. I have like this horrible fear of breaking a needle and ending up with a piece of my eye, so I just take the pins out as I go. Then I join the side seams to the front pieces, straight edge to bias edge, which was trickier to work out than you'd think. I actually had to recut the side pieces a couple of times because I cut them from a part of the bedsheet that was really threadbare and fragile, and the panels warped and wouldn't hold their shape. So if I did this again, I'd probably mark the bias edge of each panel just because it's surprisingly easy to get the pieces the wrong way around. Then I joined these with a French seam by sewing them wrong sides together at 1/4 of an inch to start with, and then I trimmed the seam allowance back to 1/8 of an inch before pressing them right sides together and sewing them again at 1/4 of an inch. If you're not familiar with French seams, they just help stop the edges fraying, and although I'm not really striving for historical accuracy, I still couldn't really bring myself to put this project through the overlocker. Even when I'm making modern projects, I tend to try and use the overlocker as little as possible unless I'm sewing with jersey or like a sweatshirt knit. So there you can see the finished French seam. The instructions for the back panels simply tell you to pleat the back panel to fit the inner panel. So because I'm not using an inner panel, I've had to measure the inner back pattern piece and calculate the difference between the outer back piece and the inner back piece. And then I try to get scientific about this and try and measure the pleats and mark them out, but this was a bit of a fail. So in the end, I just widened the pleats about 3 times because my maths was clearly off. But I got there in the end, after several attempts. And then I basted them in place on my machine. I actually time-lapsed that bit of me redoing the pleats just so that you can have a chuckle at how many times I take them out and redo them. Also note how slowly I'm sewing here again because I don't want to sew over these pins. Yep, wrong pin cushion, Liz. So there you see the nice pleats in the back, and this will give a nice gathered effect at the back of the petticoat. Now on to the waistband. Note the lighting change because it actually got really dark and I have to sew at night, otherwise I don't get to sew at all. So I turned up the waistband edge by 1 centimetre and pressed it in place. And then I find the centre point of the waistband and mark it with a pin and pin that to the centre back of the back piece. And then I pin the waistband to the centre front and leave a 1 centimetre overhang so that I can sew the waistband in place later. And then the instructions for the pattern tell you to pleat all of the excess waist into the waistband at the side panels. So I did this and basically tried to make sure that I had it even on both sides, and then just basted it in place before trying it on, just to double check that the pleats were all sitting where I wanted them to and they look pretty even if they're not entirely mirrored. but I was quite happy with that. I was a little bit worried at this point that the waist seemed to be a bit snug, but then remembered I'll be corseted when I'm actually wearing it. So I fold the waistband over to the wrong side and leave the folded edge slightly lower than the edge that's attached to the skirt. And then I sew down the short edges in a line with the petticoat skirt edge. And then when you fold it right side out, you end up with a nice, neatly finished waistband. I could have done a stitch in the ditch here to attach the waistband to the wrong side, but in my opinion it never really looks that neat, so I decided to just whip stitch the inside down. To be honest, I would do this on any kind of modern project as well, where I had a waistband that needed catching down on the inside, just because I don't really think that it looks good to top stitch it directly or stitch in the ditch. Then I hemmed it and folded the bottom edge up by 1 centimetre and then again by 2.5 centimetres, and I ran this just through the machine because frankly it won't be seen, it'll be hidden by the ruffle. I roughly marked my knee line with a pin and then measured up from the hem, which gave me 12.5 inches. And then I marked all the way around the skirt in heat removable pen at that point to mark where the ruffle would be attached. And then I calculated the circumference of the skirt at that point, doubled it, which gave me the length of the ruffle that I would need. And then I divided that by the length of my ruler minus 1 inch to account for seam allowance. This just felt like the easiest way for me to measure it out, which meant I needed 5 panels to make up the ruffle the length that I wanted it. And I needed to cut those 13.5 inches high. If you remember, my ruffle height is 12.5 inches, so I left an extra inch to account for seam allowance on there. When I had a stack of 5 cut out, I pinned them short end to short end and finished them with a French seam as before. And that left me with one huge continuous loop, which will become a ruffle when we gather it up. So I ummed and ahed for a while to decide how to best finish the bottom hem, and then decided to just do a narrow hem by running the entire thing through the machine, 1/4 inch away from the edge, pressing along the stitching line and then folding that up again and top stitching it. I did think about just adding the broderie anglaise trim directly on the top and folding it up, but I felt really uneasy about the raw edge that was going to leave underneath the trim, so I didn't do it that way in the end. And then I attached the broderie anglaise trim on top, just above the stitching line of the hem, so that that won't be seen when the trim is folded back down and pressed. So then I ended up with a huge tube with my broderie anglaise trim attached to the bottom, and to evenly gather it up, I find the quarter points by folding it in half and then folding it again and marking those with a pin. And then I do the same on the skirt. I mark the quarter points with pins. What I didn't actually get any footage of is the fact that I ran gathering stitches between the pins on the ruffle loop, and that was just to make sure that I didn't have one big long length of gathering stitches. It just makes it a bit easier. So then I pinned the ruffle to the skirt by matching up the pins at the quarter points, and then I gathered the ruffle in between the 2 pins to match the width of the skirt. And this was a massive faff, and it's really difficult to get these kind of even. You can brush them out with a pin to get them looking a bit more even, but the most difficult part that I found was when you pin the ruffle in place, the pins want to fall out. So as you can see here, I actually ended up hand basting the ruffle to the skirt of the petticoat, which made it a lot more stable. And really, it only took 10 minutes to do this versus probably what would have been an extra 15 frustrating minutes of trying to get pins to stay in place. Then I ran it through the machine, making sure that all of the ruffle and the skirt was laying nice and flat and even underneath the presser foot. It's worthwhile just going slow here and making sure that everything is lining up properly. If you end up getting the skirt folded over underneath and sewing it to itself, it just ends up being a bit of a nightmare. The raw edge of the ruffle at the top is hidden with some broderie anglaise insert tape. I pinked the raw edge of the tape and fold it over, and then ran a line of stitching along the top of the insert channel, just being careful not to stitch through the eyes of the insert channel. Ooh, bit premature with the pinking scissors there. So I ran right up to about maybe a centimetre away to cut the thread, and then I pinked the edge and fold it over in the same way as I started and butt the edges up together, and it just makes it a nice neat finish. And just sew over that edge to make sure that it doesn't come free. So to create the insert channel, obviously I repeated that process just below the eyelets, and then threaded a ribbon through the insert channel. I didn't have a ribbon in the width that I needed, not one that I liked anyway, so I used a wider ribbon, and it kind of folded itself in half through the channel. So what you'll see is I had to manipulate it backwards and forwards a little bit through the channel just to get it to lay flat and properly folded. And then I finished the ribbon off with a nice bow. And then I sewed some hooks and eyes on. I did sew these in the wrong place to start with because I didn't try the petticoat on with my corset, and then later found out that they were in totally the wrong place. So there's a top tip. If you're doing this, basically try the petticoat on with your corset before you finish it off. So there we go, the petticoat's finished. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you want to see more videos in this series, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!